Hi, everyone. Welcome to dinanddaf. I'm Elana Stein, Hain, and we use this space to think about halakha conceptually. What we're doing today is the second of three in a mini-series about Cheresh, שוטה, and וקטן. Those categories within halakha where the people who are who are characterized by those statuses are not considered from a halakhic point of view b'nei dat or benot dat. And what we want to understand is a little bit more about each one of these categories, and especially for the Cheresh and the שוטה, to what degree do these things obtain today? So we looked at שוטה or שוטה first, and the reason we did that is because the Cheresh is then compared to the שוטה. So one thing that we should keep in mind, which is the Mishnah that started this all for us. Mishnah in HaChovel that says a cheresh and a שוטה and a וקטן pgiatan ra'ah. If you get into a physical altercation with them, that's no good. Why? Because if you hurt them, God forbid, you have to compensate them. But if they hurt you, God forbid, they don't have to compensate you. And I love starting with that as our frame because it recognizes the full dignity and awareness of the situation of life experience of the cheresh and the שוטה and the וקטן. That on the one hand, we want to make sure that they are protected. And on the other hand, we do not want to expect something from them that actually they are unable to do. So last week we talked about psychosis and delusions in the conversation about שוטה. This week we are talking about being deaf and being unable to speak in the case of the cheresh or the chereshet. One thing we must keep in mind is, how long ago did Helen Keller live? I mean, the idea of somebody who was unable to communicate with the world because they were both deaf and unable to speak, it is only natural that they would be compared to a שוטה or a שוטה who didn't have medication, meaning people were unable to communicate about the same reality with each other because they saw reality completely differently. And this was the assumption about the cheresh as well, not only about the שוטה and the שוטה. And I would say that just as medication, thank God, has helped change our understanding of the שוטה and the שוטה, so too, developments in everything from sign language to teaching the deaf how to speak, schools for the deaf, have impacted our understanding of cheresh and how that applies today. So what I want to do is I want to start with a pithy Rambam that will just give us a general baseline, I would say, to work with. I'm going to share my screen. One moment. Here we go. Let's try to get this into presentation mode even nicer. Okay, so the Rambam says in Hilchot Ishut, Cheresh v'chareshet hamarim b'chol makom. When we refer to a cheresh or a chareshet, Hain ha'ilmim she'ein shamim v'lo medabrim. We're talking about people who both cannot hear and cannot speak. Aval mi shemedaber ve'eino shomea, somebody who can speak even if they cannot hear. Oh, shomea ve'eino medaber, or they can hear but they cannot speak. Hareu kechol adam. They're treated like anybody else in the eyes of halakha. And anybody who is fully compos mentis, I guess we would say, and are not deaf and unable to speak, and are not under the grip of psychosis or delusions, nikraim, I don't know why the tough is there, nikraim pikach upikachat. They're called a pikach or a pikachat, which literally means smart, right? Because this whole conversation is about dat, because that's how they understood it back in the day before psychotropic drugs and back in the day before schools for the deaf, right? So the question really is for us, what is considered midaber, right? Because as soon as somebody who's deaf is able to be midaberet, is able to speak, then they're out of the category of being a chareshet, right? So what counts as dibur? So first things first, the Gemara in Gittin tells us essentially what doesn't count as dibur, at least for somebody who is a cheresh or a chareshet from birth. So Amar Rav Kahana, Amar Rav Kahana says in the name of Rav, cheresh sheyachol ledaber mitoch haktav, a cheresh who can speak in writing, meaning they can respond to things in writing. Kotvin v'notnin get lishto. A get can be written to his wife. Now this is very strange because Halachically, a cheresh has kiddushin dirabanan and gittin dirabanan, and it's strange to have a situation where a cheresh would want to give a get deoraita. Why would they want to give a get deoraita? So the Gemara tries to figure out, maybe it's because this is actually yibum, and his brother was not a cheresh, and he was a pikeach. So there's a zika, there's a marital bond that is deoraita. In order to break that marital bond, he needs a get at this point, right? Okay, maybe, right? Trying to figure out why he would need it. But suffice it to say, Rav Kahana seems to say that as long as the cheresh can communicate in writing, great, that's good enough. Then the Gemara says, wait, not so fast. Today we have another source that says, cheresh lo alchubo achar remizotav achar kvitzotav achar ktav yado. When it comes to a cheresh, we don't follow, I would say like intimations that they make, maybe like a facial expression, like a wink or something, right? Or maybe a nod, I'm not sure, right? Or, movements of like, maybe like motions with the mouth, or what they write. Only when it comes to trying to do transactions with portable items, meaning not with karka, and also velo begitin, not when it comes to get. So meaning we have one source that says a cheresh who can speak in writing, we'll listen to them. We have another source that says, meaning not we'll listen to them, what they do has halakhic effectiveness, even on the level of deoraita when it comes to a get. We have another source that says we wouldn't listen to them in writing when it comes to get. Maybe in terms of other things, maybe. So how does the Gemara work through this? Tanahi, it is a machloket tanaim. Titania, as learned in a Braita, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, B'amed dvarim amurim, when is this the case, right? That we can't follow the testimony in writing of cheresh, the cheresh me'ikaro. If a person was born as a cheresh or a cheresh. Aval pikeach v'nit cheresh, if somebody was born with the ability to hear, with the ability to speak, and then they became a cheresh, hu kotev v'hein chotmin, right? You can have them write something and witnesses can sign it, right? So what does this tell you? It tells you that, halachically speaking, maybe writing can work as dibur, at least for some things, for somebody who wasn't born as a cheresh or a chereshet. But writing does not work as dibur for somebody who was born as a cheresh or a chereshet. So this is our baseline that whichever poskim are trying to figure out, does sign language count as dibur? Does speaking with a slurred speech or a speech impediment from somebody who is deaf, does that count as dibur? What they're always going to be measuring against is they're always going to be measuring against writing. Writing does not count as dibur for somebody who was born as a chereshet or a cheresh. What about these other things? Okay, so I'm going to take a look with you at 3 different positions that we find among post-game 19th century or afterwards, okay? And each position says something slightly different, and I find that significant. I find that to be significant, okay? The first is the Divrei Chaim. Divrei Chaim is Rabbi Chaim Halberstam. He's asked a question. We have schools where people who are deaf go and learn, and they learn Torah, and they understand Torah. So what's this whole business about a cheresh not being a bardat? And in fact, these people speak. It's more than they just know things and understand things. They also can communicate, right? Albeit the speech is somewhat augmented, meaning the speech is not the same. It doesn't sound the same as it would sound if they could hear. And also maybe they speak less, right? Now, it's interesting to consider the coincidence, meaning the coincidence of schools starting for the deaf to teach them how to speak and to teach them to learn, and this tshuva, right? In our case, he says, if they speak a little, afilu b'lashon ilgim or alagim, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that, even if it's slightly slurred, right? Then as long as they're, defined as a speaker based on what the Maharit said. We're skipping that for now. But in this situation, I think they should be thought of as pikech in the eyes of the law. If you can speak a little, even if it's slurred speech, that's dibur. You are now, a pikech. And then he even says further, the Rambam says in the Perush HaMishnayot that if you can't hear, you can't speak. So if they can speak, it obviously means that they can hear a little bit. I'm going to leave that to the 21st century scientists. That is not me, right? But suffice to say, the Divrei Chaim does something very important, very foundational here in recognizing a form of speech that may not sound the way someone would sound if they could hear, but is still a form of speech, and it's a form of dibur. And somebody might become a midaberet ve'ina shomat. Okay? Rav Asher Weiss goes a step further. Contemporary posek, still alive today, and he says, let's talk sign language. So the first thing he says, before I tell you anything about sign language, I want to note the following. The way we think about Cheresh today is so different than the way we think about Cheresh in the 3rd century, right? If it was up to me, the kola poskim anal dibur bizmanam. Not only that, all the poskim I've mentioned, they were all speaking about their time. Sharova chershim achein kishotim. Most of them were like shotim. It's true. And only, 1 or 2 would actually be able to overcome their limitations, and to get to a place where, their intelligence was allowed to flourish, I would say. That's how I would say it. But in our time, when the vast majority of people who are deaf are able to come to full da'at, and they function like anybody else, whether through sign language or through reading lips. These people are like anybody else, they're really like anybody else. And when it comes to, here in Jerusalem, Zachinu, we're so fortunate. We have a kollel of people who come to learn who are there. Every one of them is deaf and can't speak. Meaning, go look, they're learning Gemara just as well as anybody else. How could you even think about them and shotim in the same sentence? And remember, shotim, we're talking about people who didn't have the availability of drugs to help them, manage their psychosis. Okay, and now he gets to on the basis of that, he gets to sign language. I have a question. I'm not sure. In the following issue, he says maybe somebody who can speak fluently and consistently with people using sign language should be considered somebody who can speak but can't hear. Maybe that should be dibur. Are we talking about an oath of some sort? Do we need the person to actually speak in order to communicate? No. In a case of a neder, in a case of an oath, you need somebody to actually do bitui svatayim. They have to speak, right? But not just to communicate with people. What do I care if they're speaking through, if they're communicating through a noise, or they're communicating through moving their lips, or they're communicating through their hands? I wonder if it's mitaksher or mitkasher. Oh, maybe it's mitaksher. I think I've been reading it wrong. Mitaksher, but ofen shotev. As long as a person is able to communicate, right? No, maybe it's I don't know. Israelis, you have to help me out. Umishtamesh b'safa, right? As long as the person can can communicate in a fluid manner and can use a language, right? Like sign language, it's language, right? Va'adif miktiva. It's better than writing, because we know from the Gemara in Gittin, writing is not going to work as dibur for somebody who was a cheresh from their birth. Dilo mahani, because that doesn't work. Because writing isn't used as a medium for communication that is fast and fluid. Now, I have to say, that's not necessarily true, right? Like texting as a form of writing, it totally is a medium that's fluid and fast. I don't know what he would say about that, right? But it's an interesting distinction. He's trying to say ktiva is one thing, but sfat simanim is something else. V'lo matzinu b'gemara b'poskim, and we haven't found in the Gemara and Poskim ela de lo mahani, only that the following doesn't work. Kasher Cheresh onel she'elot b'ktav al Hain Hain v'al lav lav. When a Cheresh answers questions in writing, yes to the things that should be yes, and no to the things that should be no. Aval kol she mitkasher. What do you say? Like titkashri, like call me. I don't know. Right? Kol she b'safa kol she havek medaber. But if somebody, can communicate in using language, that's medaber, right? He's making another extension there, which is like in writing, all the person is doing is like saying one word, it's like, or like check mark, But in sign language, you're using language. And more than that, he says, we understand the lack of speech differently than they used to understand it. He says, it makes even more sense, based on what we know today, the whole issue of being both deaf and unable to speak, that has nothing to do with some sort of mental inability to speak. The only reason why someone who's deaf can't speak is because they can't hear, right? Like these aren't two different issues. They are related issues, which means it's not sort of the big sort of mental impairment that they thought it was. And so he says, therefore, near Elana it seems to me, that once the Divrei Chaim, who we started with, Paskin, the Cheresh HaMedaber b'lashon ileget midaberhu, that a Cheresh who speaks even in a slurred speech is considered a midaber. V'kach pasku l'maaseh Maranan v'Rabbanan Gdolei Hador Agon Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach v'Agon Rav Elyashiv Zatzal. And once Rav Auerbach and Rav Elyashiv paskin that way too, Kimavur b'Minchat Shlomo Sham, look it up. Hu hadin, the same should be the case. L'cheresh hamitaksher bisfat hasimanim, for a cheresh who communicates through sign language. Kevan shehu mitaksher im anashim ba'ofen shotef, because that person is communicating with people in a fully fluid manner. Uke'adam medaber l'chavero, like a person speaking to their friend. And this is what I would think, in my humble opinion, lulei demistafina mechavrai, if I was not afraid of my colleagues. Now, maybe it means I'm not afraid that somebody will disprove it. Maybe it means he thinks it's going to be an unpopular opinion. Not clear. And I want you to plumb the depths of this. Okay, so this gets really interesting. It's moved beyond the Divrei Chaim. Maybe it's also because the development of sign language, right? If you look historically, the development of sign language, not only the development of sign language, but its recognition as a language, right? How long does that take? I want to look at a third, and with this I want to end, which is Rabbanei Tzohar. Now, Rabbanei Tzohar go, I think, 1 second. So yeah, I think that they go one step further because they're not lulei de mistafina. They don't seem to be afraid of making this psak, and we're about to see what that psak is. But interestingly enough, maybe it's also because they're a moetzet, meaning they are a council that works together, and so they've come to their joint conclusion, and there's power to that joint, conventional decision, meaning they convened a group to make this decision. But let's see what they have to say. And they also do a lot in not just talking about the issue of what counts as dibor, but also the reasons they have for wanting to try to include a cheresh or a chereshet as complete pikeach and pikachet members of halakhic society. So say halach l'maaseh, our practical ruling, l'dad moetzet Rabbanei Tzohar, based on our group. And remember, Rabbanei Tzohar is a group of religious Zionist rabbis in Israel. Dinam shel rubam hamachriya shel hachershim biyamenu kedin bikchim l'chodah. Say, the ruling of the vast majority of chershim in our time are their pikach, right? And they say that in the paragraph before, most people who are cheresh actually are medaber ve'eno shomea, right? They have ways of communicating. Hachra'azo, this ruling, novat b'ikara min hashikulim halakhatim habayim, comes from the following halakha calculations. So the first thing they mention is nimukehem kvedei hamishkal shel haposkim hasovrim shedin cheresh ben dat b'yameinu kidin kol adam shomea. First of all, we're resting ourselves on earlier poskim who had really weighty reasoning, and I included it in footnote 1 if you want to look some of them up, who have really weighty reasoning to understand a cheresh who's a ben dat in our time or a bat dat in our time, like anybody who can hear. But the other 3 are even more interesting, I think. 2. Marbeta she'elot hanogot lemamado hilchati shel cheresh kshuro l'dinim midrabanan. Say most of the shilas that arise, let's say, someone counting for a minyan, right? Most of those shilas are related to dirabanans. Uvedinim dirabanan midrabanan haklalu speika dirabanan lakula. And when it comes to a din dirabanan, we generally say that if we have a suffix, if we have a doubt, we're going to be lenient. By the way, I do have a question. We did say that a cheresh has kiddushin and gittin midrabanan, but not midoraita. I do wonder, how this would impact the status of marriage. And specifically, it's not just a question when somebody was a cheresh or a chereshet before they got married, because then their kiddushin was whatever that status is. So their gerushin will be the same status. But let's say somebody got married and then became a cheresh at some point along the way. I don't know how that, I'm not exactly sure. That's the example that the Gemara gave, but a little complicated. But either way, I don't know. I'm in my own head about this a little bit. Like if there was a real din d'oraita, what would they do? Okay, the third. Gadol kavod habriot. Kavod habriot really, really, really matters, right? And quoting the Gemara in Brachot, shehu dochet lo taseh shebatorah. Kavod habriot overrides a negative commandment in the Torah. What negative commandment is that? Yisur midrabanan. Rabbinic law, right? Rabbinic prohibitions. And you know what we should note? Let's say people would say, oh, kavod habriot, but that didn't apply in the conversation in the 15th century about this. Well, b'yameinu, nowadays, sharov ha'chershim hem b'nei dat u'mitkablim kishavim bin shavim b'chevra. Well, today, when they are treated as they should be, as equals among equals in society, of course it's going to be humiliating for a cheresh, imrak b'beit knesset yuram madam, if only in the Beit Knesset they're mistreated, right? Like, come on. Meaning if their status goes down only in the Beit Knesset. So that's the third. The fourth, we all have a requirement, a legal requirement, to want to bring people close to Torah and mitzvot. And that's what we're trying to do. We want to bring the cheresh and the chereshet close to Torah and mitzvah, right? So this is going beyond what Rav Rice did in a way, right? In a way, it's going beyond. One is it's just saying, listen, we're just telling you, cheresh, no, pikeach, pikacha. 2, they're telling you, well, we want to tell you what the other halakhic nimukim are, the halakhic reasonings are. And they're not only about what a pikach is. They're about whether we're talking about this issue that's derabanan or doraita, we're talking about kavod habriot, we're talking about kiruv, et cetera, et cetera. And it's interesting that they do that. Now, the way that I want to end is clearly all of these poskim, whether it's the Divrei Chaim or Rav Asher Weiss or Rabbanei Tzohar, all of these poskim are recognizing a fundamental change in the ability of someone who is deaf to be able to communicate. And that is brought about not by, oh, something magically changed in nature. It is brought about by real people advocating for schools for the deaf, real people advocating for the recognition of sign language as a language, real people, lobbying. And I think it's really interesting to consider the interplay between the development of education for the deaf and the chuvot that suddenly are realizing, wait a second, Cheresh and Cheresh, maybe we need to think about what constitutes dibur, right? Like we need to understand what constitutes dibur. So I find that very inspiring, and I hope you do too. And we'll see you next week for Katan and Katana. Thanks for joining me.